They said the Duke of Ashford was dead. They were almost right. The candles had been burning for 3 hours when Margaret Hale walked through the servants' entrance of Ashford Manor. She had not been invited. She would not have been, even if Richard Vane had been alive to send the invitation himself. A baron's daughter with a ruined name, a father who had gambled away every acre, every painting, every piece of silver, she was not the kind of woman who received invitations to Ashford Manor anymore. She was the kind of woman people pretended not to see at the market. The kind whose name, when mentioned in drawing rooms, caused a brief, uncomfortable silence before the conversation moved on. But Richard was dead. And she had no one left who remembered her when she had been someone worth knowing, except him. So she came anyway. The manor was full of people who had adored him in life and were performing their grief with great enthusiasm in death. Ladies in dark silk dabbed at their eyes in the front hall. Gentlemen stood in clusters, speaking in low voices about what a tragedy, what a terrible loss, so young, so promising. His mother sat in the east parlor receiving condolences like a queen on a black throne, her face a composed mask that Margaret suspected had not cracked once since the morning the news came. No one noticed Margaret slip past them all. She had grown very good at not being noticed. The room where they had laid him was at the end of a long corridor, lit by a single row of candles along the windowsill. Someone had folded his hands over his chest and dressed him in his finest coat, deep navy, brass buttons, the kind he always complained was too stiff at the collar. There were flowers she didn't recognize around the edges of the coffin. White ones. They smelled too sweet, the way things smell when someone is trying too hard. Margaret stood at the doorway for a long moment. She had told herself, walking here, that she only needed to see him. Just once. Just to make it real, because for some reason the words "the Duke is dead" had not yet landed anywhere solid inside her. She had heard them that morning from the butcher's boy, who had heard them from a footman, and she had stood in her cold little kitchen holding a loaf of bread and felt absolutely nothing, which frightened her more than tears would have. She needed it to be real. She stepped inside. Up close, he looked wrong. Not wrong the way the dead look wrong, that terrible stillness that can't be mistaken for sleep no matter what people say. This was different. She stood over the coffin and looked at his face for a long time, trying to understand what was bothering her, and then she realized. He had color. Not much. Not the warm flush of a living man. But not the gray-white of the bodies she had seen before, her mother, her father, her father's father laid out in this very same formal manner. Richard Vane's face was pale, yes, but there was something underneath the pale. Something that did not look like absence. You are imagining things, she told herself. Because you cannot accept it. Because you are the kind of fool who walked through a servant's entrance to say goodbye to a man who never knew he mattered to you. She pulled a chair from the corner of the room. She sat down beside him. She did not leave. The house emptied slowly around her. She heard the guests departing in clusters, the low murmur of carriages outside, the sound of a door closing somewhere deep in the manor. A housemaid came to the doorway of the room once, saw Margaret, and retreated without a word, whether out of pity or indifference, Margaret couldn't tell. The candles burned lower. The white flowers kept their cloying sweetness. Margaret sat. She was not a woman given to speeches, even private ones, so she did not speak to him. She simply sat the way she had once sat beside him as a girl, on the low stone wall that separated her father's property from his, on summer evenings when neither of them had anywhere better to be. They had not needed to talk then, either. They had simply existed in the same space, which had felt, at the time, like the most natural thing in the world. That property was gone now, of course. Sold for debts. The wall probably still stood. She wondered if he had ever thought about that wall. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning when she noticed his chest move. She thought at first that she had imagined it. Her eyes were tired. The candlelight was unsteady. She had been sitting still for so long that her mind had begun to play the small, cruel tricks that minds play in the dark. But then it happened again. A slow, almost imperceptible rise. Then a fall. Margaret stood up so quickly that her chair scraped back against the stone floor, loud in the silence. She stood over him. She watched. Her own breathing had stopped entirely. His chest rose again. Her hand moved before she had decided to move it, pressed flat against his sternum, feeling for what she had just seen. And beneath her palm, faint as a whisper, faint as something that had no business still being there. A heartbeat. Margaret Hale stood alone in a room full of flowers and candlelight and the weight of a secret that was about to change everything. The Duke of Ashford was not dead. And she was the only person in the world who knew. The first thing Richard Vane did when he opened his eyes was try to sit up. The second thing he did was fail completely. Margaret caught him by the shoulders before he could make a sound, before the instinct to gasp, to call out, to do any of the things a man does when he wakes up in a coffin could betray them both. She pressed him back down with more force than she knew she had in her, her hands firm against his chest, her face close to his. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't make a sound. Not yet." He looked at her. In the dim candlelight, his eyes were glassy and slow to focus, like a man surfacing from very deep water. She watched him take her in, the face, the dark dress, the fact that she was here at all, and she could see the exact moment recognition arrived. His expression did something complicated that she didn't have time to read. Then he did what she asked. He stayed still. He stayed quiet. She exhaled. It took him nearly 20 minutes to be able to speak, and even then it came out wrong, thick and dragging, like words pulled through mud. She sat on the edge of the coffin because there was nowhere else to sit and she did not trust her legs, and she held a glass of water she had found on the side table to his lips, and she waited. Margaret. Her name in his mouth, rough and wondering. As if he wasn't sure she was real. "Yes," she said. He stopped. Swallowed with obvious difficulty. "Why are you here?" "I came to see you." "I'm dead." "You're not." He seemed to consider this for a moment with the gravity it deserved. "No," he said finally. "I'm not." What he told her came in pieces, slowly, because he was still weak and because some of it was clearly difficult to say out loud. She did not rush him. She sat in the guttering candlelight while the rest of Ashford Manor slept, and she listened to the Duke of Ashford explain how he had come to be lying in his own coffin. 3 nights ago he had been at dinner. A private dinner, just 4 men, the kind of quiet gathering that didn't make it into the society pages. Wine had been poured. Conversation had been had. He had felt strange on the way home, not ill exactly, more like the edges of the world were going soft, and by the time his valet had helped him to his room he could barely lift his arms. He remembered the ceiling of his bedroom. He remembered the sound of his own breathing slowing. He remembered thinking, with a strange calm, "This is not right." Then nothing, until Margaret's hand on his chest in the dark. "There's a substance," he said. His voice was gaining strength slowly, like a fire catching. "From the continent. A physician's tool, technically. In large doses it slows the heart to almost nothing. Slows everything. 4 hours. Sometimes longer." He paused. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The dose, the timing, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Margaret looked at him steadily. "Someone tried to kill you. Someone succeeded, as far as anyone in this house knows." His jaw tightened. "And I think, for now, it needs to stay that way." She understood what he was asking before he finished asking it. If Richard Vane was dead, then whoever had done this believed they had won. They were not watching for him. They were not watching for loose ends. A dead man could move through the shadows of his own life and find out the truth without the truth running away from him. A living man, a living duke who had somehow survived, who was asking questions, who was a threat, was a different matter entirely. "You want to stay dead," Margaret said. "For a little while. And you want me to. I want you to not tell anyone what you saw tonight." He looked at her directly, and there was nothing glassy about his eyes now. They were very clear and very serious. "I know what I'm asking. I know it's not a small thing." Margaret thought about the housemaid who had seen her in the doorway and retreated. She thought about the butcher's boy who had told her the news with no particular feeling, as if passing along information about weather. She thought about what it meant to keep a secret of this size, the weight of it, the way it would sit inside her every time someone in the village said such a tragedy, the poor Duke, gone so young. Then she thought about the alternative, about telling someone, about who would believe her, about what happened to women like her when they made claims that powerful people found inconvenient. "No one would believe me anyway," she said, more to herself than to him. Something crossed his face. It might have been guilt. "Margaret. I'll keep your secret." She stood up, smoothed her skirt with hands that were only slightly unsteady. "But you cannot stay here. When they come to move you in the morning you need to not be in this coffin." She glanced toward the window. The sky beyond it was the deep blue that comes just before gray. "We have perhaps 2 hours." Richard Vane looked up at her from inside his own coffin with an expression she had never seen on him before in all the years she had known him. It took her a moment to identify it, because it sat strangely on the face of a duke. It was the look of a man who had no one else. "I know somewhere we can go," she said. "Can you walk?" "I'll manage." "That's not what I asked." A pause. Then, with some difficulty, "Probably not well." "All right." She picked up her shawl from the chair. "Then we'll go slowly." They left through the servants' entrance, the same door she had used coming in, the door that society had, without ever quite saying so, designated as hers. It struck her as bitterly appropriate. She had half carried him through the corridor, his arm over her shoulders, his steps uneven and labored, and neither of them had spoken because there was nothing to say that was more urgent than silence. Outside, the night air was cold and clean and smelled of rain on stone. Richard stopped for a moment and tilted his head back and just breathed it. She let him. She understood, she thought, what air meant to a man who had spent hours without it. "Where are we going?" he asked quietly. "My father's old gamekeeper's cottage." She kept her voice flat and practical, because if she thought too hard about what she was doing, about the Duke of Ashford leaning on her shoulder in the dark, about the fact that she was smuggling a dead man out of his own funeral, she might start laughing, or crying, and she wasn't sure which would be worse. "It's been empty for 2 years. No one goes there. Your father's land was sold. The cottage is on the edge of what was sold. The boundary's always been disputed." She glanced at him sideways. "No one's disputed it enough to actually go out there in the cold." Something shifted in his expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "You always knew that land better than anyone," he said. "You always knew that about me." They walked on through the dark, the dead duke and the ruined baron's daughter, and the sky above them was just beginning, very slowly, to go gray at the edges. Behind them, in the manor, the candles had burned down to nothing. In a few hours, the housemaids would come to prepare the room for the morning. They would find the coffin empty. They would find the chair pushed back, a single glass of water on the side table, and no explanation. And somewhere in the county of Ashford, in a cold little cottage with a disputed boundary and no one watching, a man who was supposed to be dead was learning to breathe again. The cottage had not been lived in for 2 years, and it showed. Margaret had come ahead of him twice in the first week, once to clear the worst of it, once to bring what she could carry without being seen. A blanket. A pot. A small amount of food wrapped in cloth. Candles, because the windows were too dirty to let in much light and she wasn't ready to clean them yet, wasn't ready for the cottage to look occupied from the outside. Richard had said very little about the conditions. She had expected him to say something. He was a duke. He had grown up in a house with 40 rooms and a staff of 60 and a cook who had trained in Paris. The cottage had a single room, a fireplace that smoked if the wind came from the east, and a bed frame with a mattress that Margaret had beaten into approximate submission with a broom handle. But he hadn't complained. Not once. That, more than anything, told her how frightened he was. By the 4th day he could walk without holding on to anything. By the 6th he was restless. Margaret came each morning before the village woke and each evening after dark, and she brought food and information in equal measure, what was being said in the shops, what she had overheard at the post office, what the Ashford servants were telling people about the empty coffin. The story that had settled, as far as she could tell, was that the body had been moved in the night by the family, for private burial, which was unusual but not unheard of, and which the family had neither confirmed nor denied because the family was too deep in grief to speak to anyone. Richard listened to all of it with the focused stillness of a man filing things away. "My mother," he said one evening. It wasn't quite a question. "She hasn't left the manor." Margaret set down the bread she'd brought and kept her voice careful. "She's receiving no one. She doesn't know." "I don't think so." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the way it did this time of year, a low persistent sound like something breathing. "Good," he said finally. "If she knew I was alive she would tell someone. Not out of malice. She just..." He stopped. "She was never made for secrets." Margaret thought about her own mother, dead 7 years now, who had been made for nothing but kindness and had been ground down by a world that mistook kindness for weakness. She didn't say anything. She handed him the bread. It was on the 8th day that he asked about her father. They were sitting on opposite sides of the fireplace. The wind was from the north that night, which meant the chimney drew properly, and she had been telling him about a conversation she'd overheard between 2 of the manor's footmen, and she had used some phrase, she couldn't remember afterward exactly what, that had made him go quiet in a particular way. "Your father's debts," he said carefully. "How bad was it, in the end?" Margaret looked at the fire. "Everything. I heard the house went. The house. The land. The horses. The furniture." She kept her voice even, because she had had years to practice keeping her voice even about this. "I kept some of my mother's things. A few books. That was all." "Where do you live now?" "I rent 2 rooms above the milliner's on Church Street." She glanced at him then, briefly. "It's perfectly adequate." Richard was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something in it that wasn't pity. She had become very good at identifying pity and this wasn't it, but something adjacent to it. Something more uncomfortable. "I didn't know," he said. "I should have. I was in London most of that year, and when I came back I heard pieces of it, but I didn't know it had gone that far. There was nothing to be done. I could have." "There was nothing to be done," she said again, more firmly. "And I didn't come here for your sympathy, Richard. I came because you needed somewhere to be." A silence. "Then, you called me Richard." She blinked. In the years since they had been children on the wall, in the years of distance and difference and the slow accumulation of the gap between a duke and a ruined baron's daughter, she had trained herself very carefully out of that habit. "I apologize." "Your Grace. Don't." His voice was quiet but certain. "Please don't. Not here." He looked around the small smoky room, the rough walls, the single candle on the windowsill. "There's no Duke here. You said it yourself, there's no one watching. I'm a dead man in a cottage." Something shifted in his expression, something that was almost wry. "I think you can call me Richard." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "Richard," she said, and the word felt strange in her mouth, like a garment she had forgotten she owned. Strange, but not wrong. "Thank you," he said simply. They began, in those long evenings, to talk the way they had never quite talked before. Not the careful social exchange of two people performing their respective roles. Not the stilted politeness of a duke and a woman he had once known, bumping into each other at the edges of society. This was something different, the kind of conversation that is only possible when the usual architecture has been taken away and there is nothing left to protect. He told her about London. About the loneliness of rooms full of people who wanted something from him. About the business of being a duke, which turned out to be less about grand halls and more about endless correspondence, disputes over tenant contracts, the management of a small empire of other people's problems, and the constant low hum of obligation. She told him about the milliners. About learning to be invisible. About the particular freedom that came with having nothing left to lose, which was not at all the same thing as happiness but was sometimes, on good days, something like peace. "You're not what I remembered," he said one night. It was past midnight. The fire had burned low. "What did you remember?" He thought about it. A girl on a wall. Very certain about things. "I'm still certain about things." "Yes, but differently." He studied her. "You used to be certain the way children are certain, because the world hadn't disagreed with you yet. Now you're certain the way," he paused, searching for it. "The way people are certain when they've been disagreed with quite a lot and decided to believe anyway." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me," she said. Richard looked at the fire. "I've been thinking about you for a long time," he said. "I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything." Which was, a pause. Cowardly, probably. The word landed in the room and sat there. Margaret did not look at him. She watched the fire do what fires do, the steady patient work of burning. Outside the wind had eased. The trees were quiet. "We should sleep," she said. "I need to be back before 6. Margaret. "Good night, Richard." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something in between. "Good night," he said. She walked home through the dark fields with her shawl pulled close and the cold air sharp on her face, and she thought about what it meant that a man who had been silent for years had chosen, in a borrowed cottage with a disputed boundary, to stop being silent. She thought about what it meant that she had sat there and let him. She thought about a stone wall in summer. 2 children with nowhere better to be. The village was asleep when she came back to it. The milliner's sign creaked in the wind above her door. She climbed the stairs to her 2 rooms and sat on the edge of her bed without lighting a candle, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what was growing in that cottage. Then she set it aside. There were more important things. Someone had tried to kill Richard Vane and they believed they had succeeded, which meant they were still out there, still untouched, still holding whatever it was they had wanted badly enough to poison a man. That was the problem. That was what needed solving. Everything else could wait. It could wait, she told herself firmly. She lit the candle. She found a piece of paper. She began to write down everything she knew. Every name Richard had mentioned, every detail from that dinner, every thread that might be pulled. It was a short list. But it was a beginning. The name came to them on a Tuesday. It came the way important things often come, not through grand revelation, not through a single dramatic moment of clarity, but through the accumulation of small details that had been sitting in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to line them up correctly. Margaret had been the one to line them up. She had spent 2 weeks moving through the village and its edges the way she had learned to move through everything since her father's ruin, quietly, at the margins, in the spaces where people forgot to watch their words because they had forgotten to watch her. She had listened at the post office and the drapers and the back entrance of the inn where the Ashford footmen drank on their evenings off. She had asked no direct questions. She had simply been present, and patient, and invisible in the way that women with no social standing are always invisible to people who measure the world by social standing. She brought her notes to the cottage on a Tuesday evening and spread them on the floor between them because the table was too small, and Richard sat cross-legged on the other side with the focused expression she was coming to recognize as him thinking hard, and together they read through everything she had gathered. It took them less than an hour. "James," Richard said. He said it very quietly. Margaret looked at him. "James Vane," he said. "My cousin." James Vane was 34 years old, unmarried, and stood to inherit everything if Richard died without an heir, the title, the manor, the land, the income, all of it. This was not, by itself, unusual. Half the aristocracy of England was built on exactly this kind of arrangement, the long patient waiting of second sons and cousins for the men ahead of them to die. What was unusual was the timing. Richard had, 3 weeks before the dinner, quietly instructed his solicitor to begin drawing up documents. Not a will, he was too young and too healthy for that to have seemed urgent. Something else. A formal agreement, a settlement, a piece of legal architecture that would, when completed, have significantly altered what James stood to inherit. "You were going to reduce his share," Margaret said. "I was going to restructure the entail. The estate has tenants who have been farming that land for 3 generations. There were promises made to them by my father that had never been formalized. I wanted to formalize them." He paused. James would have received his inheritance in full, the title, the house. But certain portions of the land would have been protected. Certain income redirected. He would have received less. He would have received less, Richard confirmed. He knew I was considering it. We had argued about it in March. Something moved across his face, something old and tired. I thought it was resolved. I thought he had accepted it. Margaret thought about the neat, careful notes on the floor between them. The footman who had mentioned, without knowing the significance, that Mr. James Vane had been the one to select the wine that evening. The physician, not the family physician, a different one, brought in from the next county, who had certified the death and who turned out to have treated James Vane's household for the past 3 years. The dose. The timing. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. "He's been in the manor," she said. "Since you died, he's been there every day. Your mother thinks it's grief." Richard's jaw tightened. "Of course she does. He's also been in conversation with your solicitor." "I couldn't find out about what." "He's moving quickly." Richard stood up. He had been restless all week, the forced stillness of the cottage wearing on him in ways that were becoming visible. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark fields. "If I don't come back soon there won't be much left to come back to. He'll have restructured everything before I can stop him. Then you need to come back." "Yes. Which means I can't be dead anymore." He turned from the window. In the candlelight his face was very serious, stripped of every social grace, every ducal composure. Just a man with a problem and no clean way through it. "And the moment I'm not dead, you become a problem. You're the one person who can confirm the timeline. Who knows where I've been, what I know, how I know it." He crossed the room and crouched down, picking up her notes from the floor, handling them carefully. "James will understand immediately that you're the one who found this. And James is not a man who leaves loose ends." The word loose ends settled over Margaret like cold water. I can take care of myself, she said. You shouldn't have to. Richard. You have been taking care of me for 2 weeks. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not even at all. You have walked here in the dark every morning and every night. You have spent money you don't have on food for someone who doesn't deserve to eat better than you. You have carried a secret that would destroy your reputation further if it got out, and you have carried it without complaint, and I am not going to walk back into my life and leave you standing in the street. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. You'll need evidence, she said finally. Not just my notes. Something a court would look at. Yes. The physician. If he was brought in specifically, if James arranged it, there will be a record somewhere. Payment, correspondence, something. I know someone who can find it. He was already moving, the particular energy of a man who had been still too long finally finding direction. My solicitor, not the one James has been talking to. My father's man. He retired to Dorset, but he's loyal and he's careful and he will not have told James anything. You'd need to contact him without being seen. I can write. You can post it. From here? A letter posted from this village. From the next town. You could go tomorrow, couldn't you? He looked at her, and there was something in the question that was more than logistics. A checking. A making sure she was still with him. Yes, she said. I could go tomorrow. Something in his shoulders released slightly. After that, he said, when we have what we need, I'll need to be seen. Publicly. Undeniably alive. He sat down across from her again, and the candlelight caught the side of his face, and Margaret thought about how strange it was to have watched a man come back to himself by degrees, like watching a tide come in. There will be chaos. My mother will, he stopped. There will be a great deal of chaos. Yes. And you will be at the center of it. Your name will be in it. There's no way to bring me back without explaining where I've been. Margaret thought about her 2 rooms above the milliner's. The sign that creaked in the wind. The village that looked past her in the market. She thought about what more there was to lose, and found, when she examined it honestly, that the answer was not very much. I know, she said. I want you to understand what that will mean. What people will say. I have spent 4 years learning not to care what people say. This will be worse than anything before. Richard. She held his gaze steadily. I know. I'm not a child. I understand what I'm choosing. He looked at her for a long time. Why? He asked. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. The way a man asks when he has been handed something he doesn't understand and wants to understand it properly. The firelight was low. Outside the cottage the fields were dark and quiet and the village was asleep. They had sat in this room for 2 weeks, moving from strangers who had known each other into something that didn't have a clean name yet, something that lived in the space between what they had been and what they might become. Margaret thought about all the careful, practical answers she could give him. Because it was the right thing to do, she said. And because, she stopped. Started again. Because I sat beside your coffin all night and I was not ready for a world that didn't have you in it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Richard reached across the notes and the candle and the careful distance she had been maintaining for 2 weeks and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with great declaration. Just took it, the way you take hold of something you have been afraid to reach for and have finally decided to reach for anyway. She let him. The letter went out the next morning. Margaret posted it from the coaching inn in Halesworth, 12 miles away, wearing her plainest dress and her most forgettable expression, and she paid for it with coins she had been saving for new boot soles, and she did not once allow herself to feel the cost of it. She was back before noon. Richard was standing outside the cottage when she came up the path, which he was not supposed to be, They had agreed, very clearly, about not standing outside the cottage in daylight, but she found she couldn't say anything about it because of the way he turned when he heard her footsteps, the immediate and uncomplicated relief on his face. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done." He exhaled. Nodded. Looked out across the fields with the expression of a man mentally drawing a line between what had been and what was coming. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. If Alderton moves quickly. And if he doesn't? Then we find another way. He looked at her. We find another way. She noticed, without remarking on it, that he had said we. She noticed, without remarking on it, that she didn't mind. 3 days later, a letter arrived for Margaret Hale at the milliner's on Church Street. It was from a solicitor in Dorset. It contained, among other things, a copy of a payment record. A significant sum, paid in cash, from the account of Mr. James Vane to a physician in the county of Suffolk, dated 6 weeks before the Duke of Ashford's death. It also contained a note, in an old man's careful handwriting. I had my suspicions. I am glad he is alive. Tell him Alderton is ready when he is. Margaret read it twice. Then she put on her coat and walked out into the cold morning and took the long way round to the cottage, through the fields, past the place where the stone wall still stood at the edge of what had been her father's land. She ran the last quarter mile. Richard Vane came back from the dead on a Thursday morning. He chose Thursday deliberately. Thursday was market day in Ashford, which meant the village square would be full, which meant there would be witnesses enough that the story could not be quietly managed or reframed by anyone with an interest in doing so. He had thought about this carefully, the way he had learned, in 2 weeks in a cottage with Margaret Hale, to think carefully about things he had previously left to other people. He walked into the square at 9:30 in the morning wearing clothes Margaret had retrieved from the cottage where she had been storing them, slightly creased, not quite right, but unmistakably his, and he stood in the middle of the market and waited to be seen. It took approximately 4 seconds. The chaos was, as he had predicted, considerable. There was a woman who fainted. There were several men who went very pale and said nothing at all, which Richard found, under the circumstances, more satisfying than the fainting. There was a great deal of noise, a great deal of movement, a messenger dispatched to the manor at something close to a gallop. His mother arrived within the hour. She stood in front of him in the square, which had not emptied because no one within a 2-mile radius was going to willingly miss this, and she looked at him for a long time without speaking. Her face did the thing it had not done, apparently, in the weeks since his death. It cracked, quite completely, and she made a sound that Richard suspected he would hear for the rest of his life. He caught her before her knees went. "I'm here," he said into her hair, which had gone grayer than he remembered. "I'm here. I'm sorry. I'll explain everything." "You will explain it now," she said, muffled against his shoulder, in the voice she had used when he was 8 years old and had done something unforgivable. "Not here," he said. "Not yet. There are things that need to happen first." She pulled back and looked at him with red eyes and a very straight spine. "What things?" "James," he said quietly. Her face changed. "Ah," she said. Just that. A small, terrible sound. She had known her nephew for 30 years. She was not, it turned out, entirely surprised. James Vane was found at the manor, in the study that had been Richard's father's and then Richard's, sitting at the desk with a glass of brandy and a stack of documents that had no business being in his hands. He had apparently been there since breakfast. A servant said later that he had seemed perfectly calm all morning, which was either the behavior of a man with a very clear conscience or a man who had long since made his peace with what he had done. When Richard walked in, James looked up from the documents. He looked at Richard for a long moment. Then he set down his glass very carefully and said, "I see." Nothing else. Just, "I see." Richard had prepared for many versions of this moment during the long nights in the cottage. Denial. Anger. A performance of shock and relief that would have been insulting to both of them. He had not prepared for the particular flatness of those two words, the absence of anything in them, and he found it colder than anything else James could have said. "Get out of that chair," Richard said. James got out of the chair. He was removed from the manor that afternoon, with Alderton's documents and two magistrates and a level of quiet efficiency that Richard suspected would be talked about in legal circles for years. There was no dramatic arrest, no public scene. James Vane walked out of Ashford Manor under his own power with a face like stone and got into a carriage and was gone. It was almost anticlimactic. Almost. The other thing happened 3 days later. Richard had spent those 3 days doing what needed doing, speaking to solicitors, reassuring tenants, sitting with his mother for long difficult hours while she processed the shape of what had happened with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had survived a great deal and intended to survive this too. He had slept in his own bed and eaten at his own table and moved through his own house, and it had felt, in the way that returning to things always feels, both familiar and slightly wrong, like a coat he had grown both into and out of at the same time. On the third evening he sent a note to the milliners on Church Street. "Come to dinner. Please. R." Margaret arrived at the servants' entrance out of long habit and then stopped herself on the step, and came around to the front door, and knocked. He opened it himself, which caused the footman hovering behind him some visible distress. "You didn't have to come to the door," Margaret said. "I wanted to," he said. "Come in." Dinner was quiet and good and they talked the way they had talked in the cottage, easily, without performance, and Richard thought about how strange it was to have this thing, this ease, this particular frequency, and to know that he had only found it through a sequence of events that included being poisoned and declared dead and hidden in a drafty cottage for a fortnight. He was not sure what that said about his life before. He suspected it said something he ought to think about carefully. After dinner they sat in the library, which was warm and smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and Richard said what he had been thinking about for 3 days. "I want you to stay," he said. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "I want to make a formal offer. A proper one. I want to court you, Margaret, openly and properly, and I want it to result in a proposal that you are entirely free to refuse, and I want you to know that I have thought about this clearly and not in the grip of gratitude, or proximity, or any of the things people will say I am in the grip of." Margaret looked at him from her chair by the fire. "People will say a great deal," she said. "Yes. My father's debts. My reputation. The cottage." She said it evenly, cataloguing, not as objection but as inventory. "A duke cannot simply. I know what people will say a duke cannot simply do." His voice was steady. "I have been a duke for 8 years and I have done what was expected of me in almost every particular and I have found it," he searched for the word. "Sufficient. A sufficient life. Not a full one. Richard. You sat beside my coffin all night." He looked at her directly. "You didn't know I was alive. You came because you couldn't not come, and you stayed because you couldn't leave, and you have been the bravest and most honest person in any room I have shared with you since I woke up." He paused. "I don't want sufficient anymore." The fire crackled between them. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Richard waited, because he had learned, in a cottage with a disputed boundary, that she was worth waiting for. "They will be very unkind," she said finally. "Not just gossip. Letters. Withdrawals. There are families who will close their doors." "I know. Your mother." "My mother," Richard said, "watched her nephew try to murder her son and has spent 3 days re-examining every assumption she has ever made about what matters. I think she may surprise you." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated and more real. I am not easy, she said. I have opinions and I express them and I don't stop expressing them because the room is uncomfortable. I know. I find it, extremely, he stopped, and the corner of his mouth moved. Refreshing. You'll find it less refreshing at 2 in the morning when I'm right about something. I expect I will, he said. I find I don't mind. Margaret looked at the fire. He watched her thinking, could almost see the shape of it, the careful weighing, the clear-eyed assessment of what this meant and what it cost and what it gave. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly, and he did not want her to make this one carelessly. Court me properly, she said at last. As you said. Properly and openly. Yes. And I will give you an honest answer. Not a grateful one or a frightened one. She met his eyes. An honest one. That's all I want, he said. It began quietly enough. A ride through the estate, properly chaperoned by a maid who was very obviously trying not to smile. A call at the milliner's that several people witnessed and discussed extensively. Richard's name and Margaret's in the same sentence, spoken in drawing rooms across the county with a range of reactions that ran from genuine warmth to something considerably colder. The coldness was, as promised, considerable. There were letters, to Richard, to his mother, to the bishop, for reasons that were unclear even to the letter writer. There were withdrawals from social engagements. There were conversations that stopped when Margaret entered rooms and resumed when she left them, the familiar architecture of disapproval that she knew very well and had spent years learning to walk through without letting it show. What was different now was that she was not walking through it alone. Richard had a way, in public, of positioning himself that was entirely without drama but entirely without question. He did not make speeches. He did not perform his support for an audience. He simply stood where he stood, and spoke to whom he spoke to, and made it quietly, consistently, unmistakably clear that the conversation about Margaret Hale's worth had already been had and concluded, as far as he was concerned, and he had no interest in reopening it. It drove certain people absolutely mad. Which Margaret found, privately, more satisfying than she had expected. It was at the Pemberton Assembly, the first major social gathering of the season, the kind that everyone attended because not attending said too much, that it came to a head. Lady Forsyth was 60 years old and had the social authority of a small government and the temperament of a woman who had never once been told that her opinions were anything other than correct. She had been, Margaret knew, the author of at least 2 of the letters. She approached them near the windows, flanked by 2 younger women who had the look of people bracing for something. Your Grace. A correct, cool nod to Richard. Then, to Margaret, a longer look, slow, deliberate, the kind designed to be felt. Miss Hale. I understand you have been keeping unusual company of late. Margaret felt Richard move slightly beside her. She put her hand, very briefly, on his arm. Lady Forsyth, she said pleasantly. What an interesting observation from someone whose company I have always found perfectly usual. A small silence. One of the flanking women made a sound that she converted, quickly, into a cough. Lady Forsyth's eyes narrowed. I only mean to say that certain arrangements, however well-intentioned, have a way of becoming a burden. To all parties. How kind of you to concern yourself, Margaret said. I find I manage my own burdens quite adequately. But I'll remember the advice. She smiled. It was a very polite smile. Lady Forsyth looked at her for a long moment, then at Richard, who was watching all of this with an expression of complete composure and something underneath it that was very close to delight. Your Grace, Lady Forsyth said, with the air of a woman retreating in good order. Good evening. She left. The 2 flanking women followed her, one of them glancing back at Margaret with an expression that was entirely different from the one she had arrived with. Richard turned to Margaret. I find I manage my own burdens quite adequately, he said quietly. It seemed appropriate. It was magnificent. Don't make a fuss, she said, but she was looking straight ahead and her chin was up and her color was high and she was, Richard thought, the most alive person in the room. They drove home in comfortable silence, the countryside dark outside the carriage windows, the assembly's lights shrinking behind them. You didn't need me to say anything, he said, after a while. No, she agreed. But it was nice not to be saying it alone. The carriage wheels turned on the road. Somewhere ahead, the lights of the village were beginning to appear. It's going to keep coming, she said. Not sadly. Just honestly. I know. And you're sure? He looked at her in the dark of the carriage, this woman who had sat beside his coffin and carried his secret and walked 12 miles to post a letter and stood in a ballroom and held her own against 60 years of social certainty with nothing but composure and a very precise sentence. I have never, he said quietly, been more sure of anything. Outside the carriage, the village lights came closer. Margaret Hale looked out the window and said nothing. But she did not move away from the warmth of his shoulder beside hers. And she did not, for the rest of the drive, let go of his hand. The proposal came on a Sunday. Not in a ballroom. Not in a drawing room with fresh flowers arranged for the occasion and an audience of carefully selected witnesses. Not with the formal machinery of aristocratic courtship, the visit to the solicitor, the letter to the guardian, the staged performance of sentiment that the social world preferred because it kept feeling at a manageable distance from everyone involved. It came on the stone wall. Richard had asked her, the previous morning, if she would ride out to the eastern edge of the estate. He had said there was something he wanted to show her. She had said yes, because she had learned to trust his requests, and they had ridden out through the pale November light with a groom at a respectful distance and the fields brown and quiet around them. The wall was still there. She had not been to this particular stretch of it in years, had avoided it, in fact, with the deliberate avoidance of someone who has decided that certain things are better not looked at directly. But here it was, low and gray and moss-covered and entirely unchanged, running along the boundary between what had been her father's land and what had always been his. Margaret sat on her horse and looked at it. You knew, she said. I remembered, he said. I've always remembered. She dismounted without waiting for help. He did the same. They walked to the wall and she put her hand on the top of it, the rough cold stone under her palm, and she thought about a summer evening when she was 11 years old and the world had seemed, briefly, like a place that would stay manageable. My father used to say this boundary was the friendliest argument in the county, she said. Both sides claimed it and neither side minded. My father said the same thing. Richard stood beside her, looking out over the field. I think they both knew it wasn't really about the wall. No, she agreed. I don't think it was. He turned to her then, and she turned to him, and the groom was very carefully studying something of great interest in the opposite direction. Margaret Hale, Richard said. He said it the way he had said her name that first night in the cottage, carefully, as if it mattered what shape it made in the air. I have been thinking for a long time about what I wanted to say at this moment, and I have discarded most of it because it was either too formal or too insufficient or both. He stopped. So I'll say the true thing, which is that I was a man with a full life that was not a full life, and then I died, and you were the only person who didn't accept it, and I have not been the same since. He paused. I don't want to be the same. I want to be whatever I have been in that cottage and in that carriage and on the drive home from the assembly, which is, more honest than I have ever been. More known. He looked at her steadily. I want to be known by you, Margaret. For the rest of it. If you'll have me. The field was quiet. The wall was cold under her hand. Somewhere above them a bird was doing what birds do in November, which is persist without explanation. Margaret looked at Richard Vane, the Duke of Ashford, dead man, Katager, the boy from the other side of the wall, and she thought about what she had told herself on the walk home from the cottage all those weeks ago. That it could wait. That there were more important things. That she was a practical woman who understood the shape of the world and did not confuse warmth in a difficult season for something more permanent. She thought about how wrong she had been. "I have 2 rooms above a milliner's," she said. "I have my mother's books and a disputed boundary and a reputation that will require considerable maintenance." "Yes," he said. "I will not be managed," she said. "I will not be installed somewhere decorative and consulted on flower arrangements. If I have an opinion I will say it, and if I am right I will say that too." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it. Your world will not be kind about this. Not fully. Not ever, some of it. My world," he said, "tried to kill me and put me in a box. I find I have revised my attachment to its good opinion." Something broke open in Margaret's chest. Not painfully. The way things break open in spring, the way ground does after a long frost, suddenly, with relief. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes?" "Yes," she said again. "That was what you were asking, wasn't it?" "It was," he said, and the smile that crossed his face was not a Duke smile, not a public smile, not any smile she had seen him produce for a drawing room or an assembly. It was the smile of a man who had been handed something he had not been sure he would be given. Unguarded. Unperformed. Entirely real. He took her hands. The groom continued to study the middle distance with great dedication. The announcement appeared in the Gazette the following Thursday. It was 4 lines long, correct in every particular, and unleashed approximately the reaction one might expect from dropping a lit match into a room full of people who had strong feelings about appropriate social arrangements. The letters came again. More of them this time. Richard read them, noted their contents, and placed them in a drawer that he had designated for the purpose, and which he privately thought of as the people who will come around eventually drawer, and the people who will not drawer, and he found that the second drawer mattered to him less with each passing week. His mother received the news with a silence that lasted exactly 45 seconds and then broke into something that was, unmistakably, relief. "I wondered," she said, "when you were going to stop being foolish about it." Richard stared at her. "You. I have watched you navigate drawing rooms for 8 years, his mother said, with the serenity of a woman who has always known more than she has said. "You were never comfortable. You were always performing." She looked at him with clear eyes. "You are not performing now." He had nothing to say to that. She patted his hand. "Invite her to dinner," she said. "The good china. I want her to know she's welcome." The dinner was quiet and warm and the good china was used, and Margaret sat across from the Dowager Duchess of Ashford and they spoke for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the kind of women they both were, which was the kind that did not require a situation to be interesting. By the end of the evening, something had been established between them that would never need to be spoken aloud. Margaret walked to the carriage afterward with Richard beside her, and she thought that this was the thing nobody told you about choosing the harder path, that it did not stop being hard. Lady Forsyth had not become warmer. The letters had not stopped. There would be events they were not invited to and doors that stayed closed and a low persistent hum of disapproval from corners of society that had decided to make her a symbol of something they wished to object to. It would not go away. But she had also learned, in a stone cottage with a disputed boundary, that the size of what you were carrying mattered less than whether you were carrying it alone. She was not carrying it alone anymore. On the morning of the wedding, which was small and early in the year and attended by fewer people than would later claim to have been there, Margaret stood in the vestry of the parish church in her mother's altered dress and held the books she had carried from the wreck of her father's house and thought about all the versions of herself that had led to this one. The girl on the wall. The woman in the 2 rooms above the milliner's. The woman who had walked into a manor through the servants' entrance and sat down in a chair beside a coffin and refused, without quite knowing why, to leave. She had not known, that night, what she was waiting for. She understood now that she had been waiting for him to come back. Not just from death, from the long careful performance of his own life. She had been waiting for him to become the person he actually was, the person she had always suspected was there, underneath the title and the obligation and the long practice of being what was expected. She had waited beside his coffin all night. It had been, she thought, the best decision she had ever made. Richard was waiting at the altar with the expression of a man who had been looking at the door since before she arrived, and when she came through it his face did the thing it had been doing more and more lately. It simply showed what it felt, without armor, without management, without the careful ducal composure that had kept the world at a useful distance for 8 years. She walked up the aisle and stood beside him. "You came," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I told you I would." "I know." A pause. "I wanted to see it anyway." She looked at him. This man who had opened his eyes in the dark and found her there, who had trusted her with the most dangerous secret of his life, who had stood beside her in a ballroom and driven home with her hand in his and asked her on a stone wall to be known, and she felt, clean and certain as winter light, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. "Ready?" she asked. "With you?" He offered his arm. "Always." Later, years later, when people asked, as people always did, how it had all begun, Margaret never quite knew how to answer. She sat beside his coffin all night. The story always started, because that was the part people wanted. The dramatic part, the miraculous part, the part that sounded like the beginning of something. But Margaret knew that wasn't really where it had begun. It had begun on a stone wall, on a summer evening, when 2 children with nowhere better to be had sat together in comfortable silence and felt, without words for it, that this was the most natural thing in the world. Everything else, the coffin, the cottage, the letters, the assembly, the wall again, the altar, had simply been the long way back to that. She had sat beside his coffin all night. Until the Duke opened his eyes. And then, at last, they both came home. People love a wedding. But what they really want to know is what came after. 1 year later. The Tenant Protection Act that Richard had been drafting before he was poisoned was finalized in the spring. It was not a grand piece of legislation. It did not make the newspapers in London. It was a quiet, carefully worded document that guaranteed 3 farming families on the Ashford estate the right to work the land their grandfathers had worked, protected their rents from arbitrary increase, and formalized promises that should have been formalized 20 years earlier. Richard signed it at the desk in his study on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was sitting across from him reading correspondence when he set down the pen. He said nothing. She looked up. He slid the document across the desk to her. She read it. Then she looked at him over the top of the page. "Your father would have done this," she said. "Eventually," he said. "I did it first." She handed it back. Their fingers touched briefly over the paper. Outside, the Ashford fields were green and new and entirely unaware of what had nearly happened to them. James Vane stood trial in the autumn. The case rested on Alderton's documents, the payment records, the physician's correspondence, a letter discovered in James's desk that he had, with extraordinary overconfidence, never destroyed. The physician cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for leniency and gave testimony that was detailed, clinical, and damning. James said very little throughout. He had the look, Margaret thought, from her seat in the gallery, of a man who had long since concluded that the world owed him something and was only now, slowly, revising that conclusion. He was found guilty. He was not transported. He was stripped of his inheritance rights, banned from the county, and quietly relocated to a modest property in the north that a distant branch of the family agreed to oversee. It was not, some people said, enough. Richard did not attend the sentencing. He spent that afternoon riding the eastern edge of the estate alone, and when he came home he sat with Margaret in the library for a long time without speaking, and she did not ask him to speak, and eventually he said, "I think I'm done with it now," and she said, "Good," and they had dinner and it was over. Some things end not with justice but with the decision to be finished. The Dowager Duchess. Richard's mother took to Margaret with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for someone interesting to arrive. She taught Margaret the household accounts, not because Margaret needed managing, but because she wanted her to have the full picture, which was her way of saying this is yours now, treat it well. She introduced her at county events with a brevity and a tone that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that the conversation about Margaret's suitability was closed and had been closed for some time. She also, on one memorable occasion, told Lady Forsyth at a dinner party that she found small-minded consistency the least interesting quality in a person. Lady Forsyth did not reply. Margaret heard about it second-hand and said nothing to the Dowager Duchess directly but brought her particularly good chocolates from the town the following week. The Dowager Duchess understood perfectly. The cottage. The gamekeeper's cottage on the disputed boundary was repaired in the summer, new roof, cleared windows, the fireplace that smoked in an east wind finally fixed after what turned out to be a very simple problem with the flue. Margaret had asked for it to be kept as it was, otherwise. Same walls. Same floor. The table, replaced with one the same size. Richard had not asked why. He understood why. They went there sometimes in the evenings, just the two of them, and sat by the fire the way they had sat that winter, talking, or not talking, or reading on opposite sides of the room in the particular companionable quiet that is only possible between people who have nothing left to prove to each other. It was not a grand room. It was their room. Margaret. 2 years after the wedding, Margaret Hale, Margaret Vane, now, though she kept both names and used them as the situation demanded, was approached by a woman in the village. Her name was Mrs. Clara Webb. She was 31 years old. Her husband had died in the spring and left debts that were consuming the small amount of property she had. She had 2 children and 3 months before the bank moved on the house. She had heard, somehow, that the Duchess of Ashford was someone you could speak to directly. Margaret sat with her for 2 hours in the small parlor she had claimed as her own, not the grand drawing room, the small one, with the comfortable chairs and her mother's books on the shelves, and she listened to everything. Then she asked 3 very specific questions. Then she said she would look into it and come back the following week with an answer. She came back with a solution. It was not a grand solution. A restructured payment arrangement, a position for Mrs. Webb managing the household linen inventory at the manor, a cottage on the estate that had been standing empty. It was enough. Mrs. Webb cried, briefly, and apologized for crying, and Margaret said there was nothing to apologize for and meant it. Afterward Richard found her in the parlor still sitting with her mother's books around her and asked how it had gone. "Fine," she said. "There's another one next week. A situation with a tenant family in the North Field. I want to look at the lease agreement before we talk to them." Richard leaned in the doorway and looked at his wife, who had 2 rooms above a milliner's in her past and a disputed boundary in her bones and a very clear idea of what a title was actually for. "Should I be there?" he asked. "For the lease meeting, yes. For the other, no. She'll speak more freely without a duke in the room." "Fair," he said. He brought her tea. She read the lease. The wall. On a Sunday in late summer, 3 years after the wedding, they rode out to the eastern boundary. The wall was the same. It was always the same. Stone doesn't change on a human timeline, and Margaret had always found this quietly reassuring, that some things simply persist, indifferent to what happens around them, reliable in the way that very old things are reliable. They sat on it, side by side, the way they had as children. Below them the fields ran gold and long in the afternoon light. The boundary between what had been her land and his ran straight and old through the middle of it, invisible now, meaningful only to the two people sitting on the wall above it. "Do you remember," Richard said, "what you told me that first night in the cottage? When I asked why you came? You weren't supposed to remember that. I remember everything you say." Margaret looked out at the fields. "I said it was the right thing to do." "And the other part?" She was quiet for a moment. "I said I wasn't ready for a world that didn't have you in it." "Yes." He was quiet too, for a moment. The fields moved in the light wind. "I think about that often. That you sat there all night not knowing. That it could have gone the other way. It didn't." "No." He turned to look at her. "It didn't." She met his eyes, and there it was, the thing that had been true for a long time before either of them had found the words for it, the thing that had grown in a cottage and survived a ballroom and been spoken on a wall and had not, in the years since, diminished in any measurable way. "I'm glad you woke up," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm glad you stayed." The fields were gold. The wall was old. The afternoon went long and easy around them, the way good afternoons do. They stayed until the light changed. They always did. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.